Welcome to my messy studio, everyone. My name is Mark, and I'm an art professor and a fountain pen enthusiast. And in this video, we're going to compare three new oversized pens. The massive Majohn P141, the jumbo Junlai 930, and the ample Asvine V800. These pens have been making shockwaves in the fountain pen community lately, but so far no one has reviewed them from an artist perspective. And since I happen to use fountain pens exclusively for making art, I feel that it's my duty to remedy this situation. And since the best way to judge a pen is to compare it to another pen, I'm going to turn this review into a battle royale and see which pen is the best of the three. Let's get started. But before I do, I'd like to briefly tell you about my YouTube membership program. For a small monthly fee, channel members have access to a library of full-length tutorials with 2 new videos every single month. It's a great way to support my channel and get access to detailed, long-form instruction. Okay, back to the regularly scheduled program. The Majohn P141 is a new entrant into the Mont Blanc 149 clone market, which includes the Jinhao X159 and the Winsung 630. In terms of dimensions, it's almost identical to the original Mont Blanc, being 14.5 centimeters capped, uncapped 13.2 centimeters, and 16.5 centimeters when posted. Here it is, in case you don't have an original Mont Blanc 149 next to a Lamy Safari, which is a fairly large pen. In terms of weight, it's also very similar to the Mont Blanc 149, coming in at 33 grams to the Mont Blanc's 36. The first thing that struck me about this pen was its surprisingly solid build quality. The plastic and metal rings are polished smooth and there are no rough edges. The pen has a pleasing weight to it, is very comfortable to hold, and is well balanced, though when posted could be considered a bit back heavy for long writing or drawing sessions. By the way, unlike the Winsung 630, which for some odd reason simply refuses to post, this pen posts and does so securely. The tapered grip section, while short, has smooth and low-profile threads which don't dig into the fingers. Furthermore, the thickness of the barrel is relatively uniform throughout, so you can grip the pen anywhere, even behind the grip. The pen features a piston filling mechanism with about 1.5 milliliters of ink capacity, which for a pen this size is not that great, considering that the TWSBI Eco, a much smaller pen, has a capacity of 1.8 milliliters. This is still a fairly large amount of ink, however, so it's not something I'm going to complain about. Like the Mont Blanc 149, this pen requires a special tool to unscrew the piston mechanism, which has to be bought separately. The mechanism looks to be made of brass and is solidly built and operates smoothly. I'll leave other, more engineering-minded reviewers to comment on the details of pen construction, but removing the piston mechanism frequently is not recommended, since it puts stress on the pen, especially when you have metal on plastic parts like we do here. This steel number 8 size nib sits inside a housing unit that I was able to unscrew but not pull out of the housing unit. I didn't want to risk applying more pressure since the tines on the feet look delicate and I didn't want to break them. That the housing unit comes out is a good thing since it makes the pen easier to clean. But the fact that the nib and feed don't pull out is a problem, since many waterproof inks create buildup under the nib that is not easily flushed out and can only be removed by pulling the nib and feed from the housing. This will prevent me from using the pen with waterproof ink in the future, limiting this pen's value. Let's take this pen out for a test drive and see how it performs in my series of tests. To keep things consistent, I'm drawing on Strathmore Bristol paper with a smooth surface and using Noodler's Lexington Gray, a transparent gray ink which will allow us to see the wetness of the pen. In the consistency test, this pen puts down a consistent line without skipping at every speed and every direction. This is a very pleasant surprise, since many of the Majohn nibs I've encountered have been scratchy, dry, and skippy. This is the first one that is actually smooth, wet, and consistent. Perhaps this nib is an anomaly, but it looks like this company has made improvements in their nibs. In the line variation test, this nib exhibits a touch of flex, going from a medium fine to a broad line with pressure. This variation is slight, but still noticeable. In reverse writing, the nib puts down an extra fine line, but eventually dries out and stops writing. Even so, such reverse writing is very useful since the normal line width on this pen is a bit too thick for my drawing style. I would give this pen a 2.5 on my flex rating scale, which goes from 1 through 10, placing it solidly in the soft nib category, short of semi-flex, which starts at around 4. In the feedback test, this nib is on the smoother side, exhibiting just a pinch of feedback, exactly how I like my nibs. I personally like to feel the nib make contact with the paper and don't like it when the feeling is missing entirely. And in the wetness test, this pen is on the dry side, but not overly so, like many of the Majohn pens I've tried. The issue is often not due to a lack of ink flow, but from the tightness of the nib tines. On many of my Majohn pens, this can be corrected by pulling the shoulders of the nib back slightly, which relaxes the tine pressure and allows for a more generous ink flow. Now let's try drawing with this pen, and as I draw, I'll share my conclusions. As always, I'm working in my Talon's Art Creations sketchbook and continuing to use Noodler's Lexington Gray ink. Over the years, I've had a love-hate relationship with the Majohn brand, also known as Moonman. The company often produces well-built, often interesting and innovating pen bodies, paired with absolutely horrific nibs. And whenever possible, I've swapped out the original nibs on those pens with something else. Since in this case, swapping nibs wasn't possible, buying this pen was risky. It was therefore a relief to find that the nib in this pen performed so well. The lines here are juicy, but not overly so, and the line variation is elegant and pronounced. And while for my drawing style, an extra fine point is preferable, the reverse writing compensated for it, creating an extra fine line, perfect for those fine value transitions. This would be a good time to discuss the issue of pen size, since all of these pens are way on the larger side of the spectrum. I would say the size of the pen is generally not an issue, so long as the grip section is comfortable, the pen is well balanced, and the weight stays under about 45 grams. However, there is a subtle yet noticeable positive effect in working with pens this size. These larger pens do feel somehow more substantial in the hand, which can lead you to slow down a touch, which, in almost every case, is good for your drawing. As for whether deliberately working with a larger pen to slow yourself down is a good idea, I'm not so sure. At some point, you just have to learn to take your time with whatever pen you're using, even if it's a tiny little pen with no weight to it at all. So, to conclude this review, this is a well-built, comfortable, well-performing pen that feels like it should be much more expensive than its $30 price point. It has a very pleasant, bouncy nib that puts down a consistent wet line that's great for drawing, though again, I wish it also came in extra fine. My only reservation, and it's a big one for those who want to use this pen with waterproof inks, is that the nib and feed do not pull out of the housing unit, making the pen difficult to clean thoroughly. But so long as you take care of this pen and don't use it with waterproof inks, you'll be fine. Of all the Mont Blanc 149 knockoffs, this is far and away the best made. So if you're looking for a cheaper substitute, this is the one to go for. Now let's take a look at this absolute monster of a pen, the Junlai 930. I believe Junlai is the new name for the brand Wing Sun. This pen absolutely dwarfs the other two and is the largest pen in my collection. Here it is next to the Lamy Safari. When capped, it comes in at a staggering 16.6 centimeters, but because it has a pretty long cap, it loses a full centimeter, becoming a slightly less staggering 15 centimeters. However, when posted, it becomes an absolutely gargantuan 19 centimeters. Why you'd want to post this pen, I don't know, but it does post securely. The pen weighs a hefty 42 grams. But 14.5 of those grams are in the cap, which contains a lot of metal hardware, so the pen without the cap is 27.5 grams, a perfectly comfortable weight for a pen. Like the previous pen, the grip section is short and slightly tapered, but here the threads are a touch prominent and on the sharp side, digging into the fingers. We'll see if that's an issue when we actually draw with a pen, but I suspect that it will be. Besides the sharp threads, there's also the issue of the girth of the grip section, which is about as wide as the Junlai 9019, which I criticized before for being slightly uncomfortable. The balance of this pen is slightly different than that pen, so I'll reserve judgment until I draw with it, but I suspect that this will be an issue as well. Otherwise, this pen looks to be very solidly built, using a very dark, semi-transparent resin that glows the same red color under a light as the precious resin of the Montblanc 149. The pen caps and uncaps with a satisfying smoothness, and all the metal furniture is nicely polished, if that's something you care about. This pen is a piston filler that holds 2 milliliters of ink, a good size, but not impressive considering that a regular Montblanc 149 holds about as much. One thing to note is that you usually don't get a full fill from piston fillers, so you're probably not carrying as much ink as you think. That said, the ink window on this pen is nice and large, so you can get a pretty good idea of the ink level. The pen comes with a large wrench for unscrewing the piston mechanism, which is mostly brass. Again, I don't recommend you do this to your pens often, since putting them back together in working order can be tricky, and because this does put stress on the pens, especially since we're dealing with metal on plastic parts. Still, it's good to know that this can be done, since you will eventually need to re-grease the piston mechanism or deep clean your pen. This pen features a giant number 9 sized steel nib, the first one I've encountered in this size. Unfortunately, I was unable to unscrew the housing unit. Other pen reviewers have mentioned that the housing unit is sealed, but that it can be removed with force. I'm not going to risk doing that, since the fins on the feed look to be very thin and fragile. This is a major issue for artists, since the difficulty of removing the nib unit makes the pen even more difficult to clean than the Majohn P141, since you can't even remove the housing unit from the pen. Let's take this lumbering giant of a pen out for a spin and see how it performs in my series of tests. In the consistency tests, the pen performed perfectly, putting down fine, consistent lines in every direction and at every speed. This, like the Majohn P141, is a very pleasant surprise as well as a relief. I can't say I've had a good experience with this brand, with many other pens exhibiting frustrating flaws in their pen bodies, and especially their nibs, which are almost always scratchy, inconsistent, and dry. And while I've managed to switch out the nibs in my other Wing Suns, even if I could remove this nib, where am I going to find a number 9 size nib to fit into this pen? In the line variation test, despite being labeled as a fine nib, it puts down a line closer to a medium, and with pressure squeezes out a bit of additional width, ending at a broad line. The variation is really barely noticeable here, though the pen does have some bounce to it. The reverse writing, however, is very nice, creating a consistent extra fine line that, unlike the previous pen, does not dry out. In the line variation rating, I would rate this below the Majohn P141, giving it about a 1.5. In terms of feedback, this pen is very similar to the Majohn, with a pleasant touch of feedback, feeling neither scratchy nor perfectly smooth, just how I like it. And in the wetness test, it's noticeably juicier than the previous pen, falling into the wet category. Nothing super gushy, still perfectly suitable for my drawing style, which uses a lot of layered lines. Now let's draw with this pen and see how it performs. Consistent with the tests, the pen puts down a smooth, juicy line that is super fun to work with. And while I wish, like the Majohn P141, it came in an extra fine as opposed to just a fine, the excellent reverse writing makes up for it. We've already touched on the possible advantage of using oversized pen bodies for drawing. But what about the size of the nibs? Does a larger nib confer any advantages? Ultimately, the most important factor in a nib is not the size, but the geometry of the tipping material and the flow of the ink through the nib, something that is mostly regulated by the feed. But one advantage is the slight softness of these large nibs, and I'm not talking in terms of line variation, since in all of them it's very little, but rather a gentle bounce akin to the soft suspension of a luxury car from the 80s, let's say a Cadillac. This cushiony suspension is very pleasant, though how it actually affects the drawing process I can't say. However, there might be another, more significant advantage to these large nibs, in that it automatically creates an optimal drawing distance. If you look at a common dip pen, you'll notice two things. One, that they tend to be quite long, and two, that the grip has a reverse taper which enforces a grip farther back. This distance is ideal for longer strokes and allows for more elegant looking curves. This is a grip I often try to reproduce in fountain pens by holding the pen behind the grip section and on the barrel. With the Junlai 930, I can grip the pen normally and still get that optimal distance. Such long nibs also have a rather irritating disadvantage, in that they have to be filled from a bottle that is full enough to allow the nib this size to suck in ink. For example, if you have a bottle that is low on ink, the only way to fill the pen is to transfer the ink into a device like this. Not a big deal, but an annoyance nonetheless. Let's get back to the drawing, because after 20 minutes of working, the width of the grip section and the sharpness of the threads began causing discomfort. This was no surprise, since the same thing happened to me with the Junlai 9019, which has a similarly girthy grip section. These things are subjective, of course, based on hand size and drawing style. But for me, for the way I work, this pen just isn't comfortable, which is a shame because it has a wonderful nib that I really enjoyed working with. I suppose one could get used to drawing with a pen this size, as one could get used to drawing with a super narrow pen or a pen that's super heavy. But I think this would take continuous and extended use, and since I tend to cycle through pens, even in a single day, the prospect of working with a single uncomfortable pen long enough for me to get used to it just isn't feasible. So, to conclude, this is a really fun, well-made novelty pen to show off and enjoy, which might be great for signing important documents and for short writing sessions. But as a drawing tool for artists, this isn't something particularly practical. Now let's talk about another new exciting entrant to the pantheon of paunchy pens, the Asvine V800. Asvine has really been hitting it out of the park lately with their excellent vacuum filler, the V126, which is a close copy of the Pilot Custom 823, and then these two very sleek pens, the P36 and the V200, which are essentially knockoff designs of two luxury pens made by Conid. If you're someone that's put off by knockoff designs, then forgive me, but as I see it, these pens are not directly competing with their much higher priced originals and are causing no harm. In the case of Asvine, these pens are also very good in their own right, providing people with humble means, such as myself, with high quality drawing instruments. The Asvine V800 comes in a variety of solid and clear finishes. In this case, I chose this one made of clear acrylic with handsome brown and blue swirls. The shape of the pen is very close to the Montblanc 149, but slightly larger, coming in about 15 centimeters when capped, 13.5 centimeters uncapped, and a whopping 18 centimeters when posted. There's really no reason to post the cap on this pen because it's already long enough, but I should note that while the cap does post securely, it sits right on the piston knob and can turn it. However, while this might be a problem with a piston filling mechanism, on a vacuum filler there's absolutely no danger since turning the knob doesn't push ink out of the pen. The pen has a fairly short, wide grip section, but because the threads are fairly low profile and smooth, you can place your grip over them without discomfort. The pen is a substantial yet comfortable weight, coming in at 34 grams when capped, and uncapped, which is the way it's meant to be used, 24 grams. This is a vacuum filling pen, which I like for two reasons. First, the generous ink capacity, which can be significantly more than of a piston filler of comparable size. For example, this pen holds about 2 milliliters of ink, half a milliliter more than the Majohn P141. That said, getting a full draw from a vacuum filler is more difficult than with a piston filler, and usually with one draw, without the special tricks, you can only fill the pen halfway up. However, the great thing about this pen is that the grip section unscrews, eventually, so that you can fill the pen using either a syringe or an eyedropper and get the fill that you want. The second advantage of vacuum fillers is that when the piston is fully closed, the valve at the end of the rod completely seals the ink reservoir from the feed, preventing possible dripping and burping, and also letting you travel safely on flights. Besides the advantage of greater ink capacity and safety, the vacuum filling mechanism is also easier to clean and maintain than a piston filler. The pen comes with this wrench, which unscrews the valve mechanism in the back, and instead of having to carefully disassemble and reassemble the piston filling mechanism, which can be tricky, all you have to do here is pull it out, clean it, re-grease it, and put it back in. Furthermore, the fact that the grip section here also can be unscrewed makes this pen a lot easier to clean the pen from both ends. Now let's take the pen through my series of tests and see how it performs. In the consistency test, the pen performed perfectly, putting down lines at every speed and direction. Asvine nibs tend to be much better than the nibs made by either Moonman or Wing Sun, so this was no surprise. But the quality of this nib surprised me. It's quite smooth for an extra fine nib and has a great balance of ink flow that makes it ideal for drawing. Besides being a pleasant surprise, it's also a relief since I had no idea whether this number 8 size nib could be replaced if it was faulty. In the line variation test, this nib, while having a pleasant bounce to it, was relatively stiff, going from an extra fine line to a broad. In reverse writing, it did put down a smooth extra fine line. So on the line variation scale, I would give this pen a 2.75, just a touch flexier than the Wing Sun P141, and also with better performance in reverse writing. In the feedback test, this pen had a pleasant, slight feedback similar to the other two pens. However, this pen has an extra fine nib in it as opposed to the other two, which are just fine. So we have to give this nib extra credit for smoothness. Usually steel extra fine nibs, especially Chinese nibs, are scratchy. Not this one. And in the wetness test, this pen has a very well balanced flow to it, being just a touch drier than the Junlai 930, but still rating as medium wet. This, for me, is the perfect flow for drawing, allowing you to put down clean, juicy lines, and also to layer the drawing with heavy hatching without having to wait for those lines to dry. Now let's draw with this pen and see how it performs in practice. The Asvine V800 was a pleasure to use, having a comfortable grip section and great weight and balance. I think this is about as large as I want my pens to go without starting to feel hindered. And I can't speak highly enough of the nib, which really is superb. Though I felt like the nibs in my other Asvine pens were decent, I've either switched them out or ordered the pen fitted with a Bach steel nib. In this case, not that there's another option, I don't feel the need to do any switching. Really, just about everything about this pen is excellent. The overall build quality feels solid, the filling system works perfectly. Other than the rather cheap looking cap ring, my only significant gripe is that the nib and feed don't readily pull out of the housing unit, but perhaps with a rubber grip and a soak in hot water, that could also happen. This is something manufacturers need to start being aware of. It used to be that most pens were not designed to be taken apart, with everything being sealed with shellac. But in those ancient times, ink choices were limited, and most people kept their pens filled with the same black or blue ink. But nowadays, the range of ink colors available is one of the things that makes fountain pens so appealing. And pen manufacturers need to be aware that many people enjoy switching inks often and need to make pens that make switching inks and cleaning the pen as easy as possible. So, now for the final showdown in the battle of the behemoths. Let's compare all three pens on this 4-part scale and judge the winner. In the most important category, nib performance, how do these pens rate on a scale of 1 to 10? The Majohn P141 I would rate an 8. Because it's a little drier than I'd like, and though the line variation is very nice, it doesn't work as well as I'd like in reverse writing. The Junlai 930 I'd rate a little bit higher, a 9. It's a bit wetter than I'd like and could be a touch bouncier and more pronounced in line variation for such a large nib, but otherwise it glides pleasantly across the paper and is a sensitive, lovely nib to work with, and the reverse writing is probably the best of all these three pens. The Asvine V800 ranks a 10, with a perfect balance of wetness, smoothness, and line variation. Is it the very best nib I've ever used? Goodness no, but that's because it's not a gold flex nib, which is in a different category entirely. But for a steel non-flex nib, the performance here is absolutely excellent. In the category of ergonomics, the Majohn P141 is a 7. I wish the grip section was longer, but the threads here are smooth and low profile, which allows you to grip the pen farther back. Otherwise, the weight and balance are exceptional. The Junlai I would rank far lower, at about a 3. The length and weight of the pen are not the issue. The grip section is just too wide for me, and the threads on it are sharp enough to cause irritation during longer drawing sessions. The Asvine V800 I would also rate a 7. I don't really get why these pens have such short, restrictive grip sections. Not everyone grips their pens the same way, especially when drawing, and I really wish more pen companies understood this and made grip sections that allow the user some play in the way they hold their pen. In the category of ease of cleaning and maintenance, the Majohn P141 scores a 4. The housing unit unscrews, allowing you to flush the nib from the back, but since I couldn't pull the nib and feed out of the housing unit, a deep cleaning isn't possible. Furthermore, I dislike cleaning piston filling pens since disassembly and reassembly can be tricky. The Junlai gets a 2. That I couldn't take apart the housing unit, and the nib and feed don't pull out, make this a pen that I would never use with waterproof ink. And even when using water-soluble inks, you have to be very careful with this pen and flush it frequently. The Asvine V800 gets a 7. Not only is the vacuum filling mechanism easy to take apart and reinstall, but the grip section of this pen also unscrews for cleaning in the front. Had I been able to remove the nib and feed from the housing unit, this pen would have received a higher score. But as it is, I would hesitate to put waterproof ink into this pen. Lastly, in the category of build quality for the price, all these pens at the mid-$30 range really deserve an astounding 10. Being very well built and well-performing pens. So, in the rumble of the jumbo pens, we have a clear winner, with the Asvine V800 garnering 34 points, the Majohn P141 getting 29, and the Junlai receiving 24. Now, while the Asvine V800 is the clear winner, would I recommend it to the artist looking for a pen to draw with? I think I would. As mentioned in many of my videos, I'm not as interested in the pen body as I am the unique properties of the nib. At this point in my pen collecting and usage, I don't need more pens with standard Jowo or Bach nibs, no matter how great their pen bodies are. In this case, however, this pen happens to have both an excellent pen body and an excellent special nib. Its specialness coming from the excellence of its performance in terms of smoothness, wetness, and feedback, but also its unusual length, which gives it a pleasant bounciness and that additional distance from the drawing surface that makes making certain marks easier. So while the other two pens will make their way to the back of the drawer and eventually will be given away to my students, the Asvine V800 is a keeper and will definitely become part of my regular rotation. I hope you found this pen comparison useful, and if you did, hit subscribe and stay tuned to more videos like it. And of course, please consider becoming a channel member. Thank you for watching, and see you back in my messy studio very soon. Bye for now.